Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of deep woods scary stories picked by the birthday boy, Justin. I hope you have a wonderful day, my friend. And if you'd like to pick the topic of your choice and a birthday shout out, find out more on Patreon. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened last summer, somewhere deep in the backcountry of southern Blue Ridge. It's the reason I'll never backpack alone again. At the time I was taking summer classes, and we ended up with a rare 3-day weekend in June. I decided it was the perfect excuse to venture into the woods for a few days. I picked a lesser-known state forest tucked between mountain ridges, dense hardwood and steep hollows. Of course, I let my roommate and my family know the general route I'd be on, and figured that would be enough. On the drive up, just before the paved road gave way to gravel, I passed a small, weathered outdoor shop. It looked like the kind of place that catered to long-distance hikers and locals who knew where to land, and I stopped to grab a paper map just in case the GPS failed. The owner was an older guy, and while we were talking he casually mentioned a side trail that didn't appear on most maps. He said it led to a small waterfall with a deep swimming hole, somewhere past the official forest boundary. He traced it on his finger, tapping the map twice like it was a secret. He said hardly anyone went there anymore, and that should have been my first red flag. I texted my roommate and parents about the detour, parked at the trailhead and set off. The waterfall was meant to be a side trip. This was supposed to be a 3-day, 2-night backpacking loop. The first stretch overlapped with a popular long trail and was busy enough. I chatted with a few hikers, leapfrogged the same faces for a while, but as the miles passed and peeled off into narrower paths, the crowds vanished. The trail thinned, and the woods closed in. By early afternoon, about 3 miles from where I planned to camp, I felt uncomfortable. The forest had gone quiet. And as every story that you've ever heard of this nature will tell you, that's never a good sign. I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched on my neck, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. The deep woods do sometimes do that to you. The waterfall itself was underwhelming, more of a long cascade than a dramatic drop, but the pool beneath it was deep and clear. It was definitely secluded and hidden, and so I stripped down and swam for a bit, enjoying the cold plunge. While I was drying off and getting myself dressed, I started whistling to myself without thinking, some stupid tune I had stuck in my head. And then, something whistled back, the perfect imitation of the melody and rhythm. I assumed it was a bird mimicking me, so I tested it, changing the tune slightly. It copied me perfectly, over and over. It felt eerie, and also sort of fascinating, and I brushed it off. I set up camp nearby, but that watched feeling returned. Goosebumps crawled up my arm for no reason, and every time I turned, suddenly there was nothing there, just trees. That night I made a small fire and cooked dinner, and as darkness settled, the silence returned, more uncomfortable than before. I tried to ignore it and went to sleep. I woke up at first light to chaos. My campsite was destroyed. My camp stool was gone entirely. My food bag had been cut down from the tree, not torn, but cut, and everything inside was scattered across the ground, yet nothing was eaten, not even opened. That alone was a huge red flag. And then I saw bare human footprints pressed into the dirt and pine needles circling my tent. Bear in mind I was at least 6 or 7 miles from the nearest road. While I was trying to process it, a branch snapped somewhere in the woods. I turned towards the sound but couldn't see anything. And that's when I heard the whistling again, the same tune from the day before, mocking me. That's when I finally listened to my instinct. I started packing as fast as I could, shoving gear into my bag without organizing anything. The whistling moved closer. It was taunting me. Then it started coming from different directions like it was circling me. I snapped. I yelled into the trees, screaming for it to shut up, demanding to know what it wanted. And everything went silent. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then a voice answered me. My voice. It repeated my words back perfectly, but it was like coming through a broken speaker or an old TV. I didn't hesitate after that. I threw my pack on and ran. Whatever it was followed, staying just behind me. I could hear it moving fast enough, brush that should have slowed anything down. It alternated between whistling and copying my voice like it was playing with me, but never quite catching up or falling too far back. Then suddenly it stopped, and I stopped too. I turned around and I wish I hadn't. From somewhere impossibly close, something let out the most bone-chilling screech I'd ever heard, neither animal nor human, and I ran again without looking back. Less than half a mile later, I burst onto a wider trail and nearly collided with a couple hiking in. They took one look at my face and asked if I was okay, and if I was the one who was screaming. I told them everything, and they immediately decided not to go anywhere near that direction I'd come from. And we stuck together until we reached a more populated area. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what happened. Since the site was technically outside their jurisdiction, they said they'd still send someone to check it out. As I was getting into my Jeep with the woods pressed right up against the parking lot, I heard the same whistle one last time coming from just inside the tree line, and I've never driven away so fast in all my life. When I got home, I told my roommate why I was back after one night. He just stared with me and went, "Yeah, I'm never going camping with you." Neither am I. Not alone. Ever. Again. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I had a habit of longboarding at night. We were night owls, and the darkness felt like freedom. The roads and paths out where we lived cut through miles of forest, and after midnight they were completely abandoned. No surprise there. If a car ever did pass, you could see its headlights for ages and hear the engine echo long before it reached you. That, predictably, made us feel safe. We loved it so much we'd ride it for miles, sometimes not heading home until the sky was already lightening. One night we decided to push further than usual. A few miles from our regular routes was a hidden path that we loved. It was barely maintained. A narrow strip of pavement dividing a long, dark lake, with black water on both sides and trees pressing in close. After heavy rain, the path would partially flood and disappear for weeks, so we wanted to ride it before the weather turned again. The ride was about 2 miles long, with mist hanging low over the water. When we reached the end of the lake, instead of turning back, we kept going. The path narrowed even more and fed directly into a protected stretch of deep woods. This area wasn't like the other trails, with no houses or road noise nearby, or sign of any regular human traffic. The trees grew tall and tightly packed, their branches knitting together overhead. The pavement dipped sharply downhill, and when we reached the crest, we stopped and looked down into the darkness below. And that's when we saw it. At the bottom of the hill, far ahead, there was a tiny moving point of light, dim, almost like a floating ember. It drifted slowly, then paused, then shifted direction in a way that didn't make sense. We didn't shine our flashlight. Something about it made us instinctively stay still. We whispered back and forth, trying to guess what it could be. Maybe a cyclist, maybe someone camping, maybe an animal with a reflective tag. Then everything exploded at once. The single light suddenly fractured into multiple blinding beams, and the silence ripped apart by engines revving violently. The noise echoed throughout the trees, overwhelming after so much quiet. Our eyes hadn't adjusted yet, and we couldn't see anything clearly. We didn't think. We just ran. We abandoned the boards, and adrenaline took over as we sprinted back the way we'd came. Shouting erupted behind us, voices angry and loud, mixed with engines surging closer. Just as we thought we were done for, we spotted a dark break in the hillside, a steep, overgrown hollow carved out beneath tangled roots and brush. We dove in, crawling into the dirt and leaves, pressing ourselves into the earth as the sound roared past. We didn't breathe. From our hiding place, we watched them arrive at the spot where we'd been standing moments earlier. There were 4 men, 2 on 4-wheelers, 2 on full-sized motorcycles. Their headlights cut violent paths through the woods, illuminating tree trunks and low-hanging branches. They were yelling at each other, furious, but we couldn't make out the words. At first, we wondered if they were park rangers, but that idea died quickly. We'd never seen anyone patrol these woods, especially not at night, and certainly not on vehicles completely unsuited for paved trails. These men were angry and aggressive. They started calling out, "We know you're out there. Don't make this harder than it has to be." We stayed perfectly still, barely daring to whisper. Running would have given us away, so we waited. A sudden crash echoed through the trees, glass shattering, followed by one of the men yelling, "Find him now!" And that was the moment hope disappeared. They split up, engine peeling away in different directions, headlights sweeping the woods like search beams. One of them took the very path we'd used to escape. We stayed crouched in the dirt hollow for what felt like forever, watching the lights drift further and further apart, circling and then doubling back. One of them passed his own, staring point again, clearly searching in loops. I wanted to call for help, but the thought of my phone lighting up our hiding place terrified me. Even the glow of a screen felt like a death sentence. Eventually, when the lights were further away, we took our chance and ran. Straight through the woods, branches whipping our face, roots catching our feet, and every sound felt impossibly loud. Whenever headlights grew close, we dropped to the ground and hid, pressing ourselves under leaves and brush. And as the forest thinned, the hiding spots got worse, and the terror of lying barely concealed while engines passed nearby is something I haven't felt matched since. Finally, we burst out of the trees onto the intersection of 2 main roads, far from where we started. We collapsed into a ditch and called for help. That's when I noticed missing calls from our friend Connor. We were supposed to meet him later that night. I called him back, barely able to speak. By some miracle, he was already nearby and heading our way. I gave him the cross street and begged him to hurry. We stayed hidden until his car appeared, headlights never looking so comforting, and we threw ourselves into the back seat, yelling for him to drive. It was only until we were miles away did he dare ask us what had happened. We never called the police. By the time anyone arrived, those men would have gone, and we didn't want to explain why we were on restricted paths in the middle of the night. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they were doing out there. Some people speculate we could have stumbled into something illegal, and I think they might be right. But what still bothers me the most is that whatever they thought we saw, whatever made them react so violently, we never actually saw it. That's probably the part that scares me the most. Back in my college days, a little over 20 years ago now, my friends and I had a ritual. Whenever classes slowed down or we just needed to disappear for a while, we'd load up a car and head to the mountains. Not the tourist spots, not the scenic overlooks with guardrails or gift shops. I'm talking deep woods. On the weekend this happened, it was just me, my friend Bill, and his German Shepherd Monty. We headed towards a stretch of the Appalachian foothills that most people only knew was a vague green blur on a map. The semester had just started. Nothing serious was happening yet, and we wanted one last weekend before life got busy again. We had found this place months earlier, a barely maintained dirt road that cut into the forest for about half a mile before becoming impassable. From there, you had to hike about another mile or more, following a narrow trail that wasn't marked on any map. The woods grew denser the further you went. The trees pressed closer together, and the canopy was thick enough that even during the day, the light felt dim. Our campsite sat near a creek, tucked into a low clearing surrounded by tall hardwoods and pine. The ground was flat, the water was clean, and there were old trails nearby that led to rocky outcroppings, fallen logging equipment, and stretches of forest that hadn't been touched for decades. In all our previous trips, we'd never seen another soul there, not even trash. We arrived around 4 p.m. and immediately felt that familiar relief. We got a fire going as the sun dipped lower, and the forest filled with long shadows. Bill pulled out his guitar, and I grabbed a small hand drum. And after a joint or two we were jamming. Music echoed softly through the trees, then faded into the sound of the creek and insects as the night settled. By 10 p.m. we were done playing. We talked about nothing important, girls, stupid college drama, and vague plans we had for the future. The sky was clear, and we didn't even bother with the tent. We just lay out our sleeping bags out near the fire and let it burn to embers. We were comfortable, quiet, and at around 2 a.m., I woke up. To be honest, I didn't even remember falling asleep, but it was curious. The way I woke up, it was more like I was pulled out of the sleep. Monty was awake, standing stiff near the edge of the clearing and not barking, but growling low. Bill was still completely out, and so I sat up, listening, wondering why I was awake in the first place. The fire was almost gone, just a dull orange glow in the ash, and the woods beyond the clearing were pitch black. At first I thought it could be a bear or a deer that had approached camp. Perhaps a noise had woken me. But then I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. Voices. They were barely audible, like they were being swallowed by the trees. I squinted in the darkness, straining to see anything. And that's when I noticed a faint red glow. They hovered about chest height, drifting slowly closer. My half-asleep brain put it together a moment later. Cigarette embers. Someone was out there about 100 yards away and they were walking straight towards us. "Bill," I whispered urgently. "Bill, wake up." He stirred, confused, and I quickly told him what I was seeing. Monty's growl turned into barking, explosive, that shattered the silence. The red lights didn't stop. If anything, they came faster. By the time we were on our feet, they were already stepping into the edge of the clearing. 2 men in their late 30s, maybe early 40s, both rail thin, about 5'8" or so, moving with an easy confidence. They looked like they'd crawled out of the woods themselves, shirts stiff with grime, torn jeans and boots that had never seen pavement. Their beards were patchy and wild, with sunken faces, and the two of them may have had 5 teeth between them. What I noticed immediately, that made my stomach drop, were the knives. Long, heavy blades strapped to their belts, not tools or pocket knives, but real weapons with intent for harm. Monty was losing his mind, lunging and barking, teeth bared, and the men didn't even flinch. Bill shouted for Monty to calm down, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound steady. One of the men smiled. "What y'all doing out here?" he said as if we'd bumped into each other at the gas station. "Looks like you're having yourselves a good time." We told him we were camping, drinking a few beers and nothing else. They asked if we had weed. The way they said it made it feel less of a question and more of an expectation. We handed over a joint, hoping that cooperation was the safest option. They took it, lit it up, and started wandering around our camp, looking at our packs, our fire pit, our sleeping bags on the ground. Anytime Bill or I answered a question, they'd glance at each other first, exchanging looks we couldn't quite read. They asked if we wanted to smoke with them, but we declined. We said we were heading out early. That part was a lie. Finally, after what felt like forever, one of them stopped and looked straight at me. "You'll stay safe out here," he said. "You never know who you might run into in these woods." They both laughed softly, turned and disappeared back into the darkness, the red embers fading away as they were swallowed by the trees. Neither of us slept after that. As soon as there was enough light to see, we packed everything in silence and hiked out fast. We were anxious the whole time, and were sure that they were on our trail, but whether that's true or not, I never found out. We never went back to that spot. What still gets me is how they looked, and the knives, and the fact they knew exactly where we were when we were deep in the woods miles from anything, and if it hadn't been for Monty, they would have probably been standing over us as we slept. Who knows? They might have put some of those knives into our body, just to make sure that we never saw the light of day again. I grew up in upstate New York, not near any city people would recognize, in a small town. But my best friend's family lived miles outside of it, tucked away beyond any real semblance of civilization. His family owned a massive stretch of land, and their neighbors, who were just as isolated, had given permission for free roaming. Altogether, it was hundreds of acres of uninterrupted forest. We'd been friends since elementary school and had a funny dynamic. He loved coming into town to be around people. Bear in mind, this town is just a small town. And I loved going to his place because once you stepped off the gravel driveway, it felt truly peaceful. When we were around 14, we started pushing deeper into the woods than we were supposed to, partly out of curiosity, or maybe defiance. His parents were strict about how far we would go, not because they were paranoid, but because people genuinely do get lost out there. Bears were common, so were deep ravines and sinkholes hidden under leaves. And after a handful of long hikes, maybe a mile or so uphill from the house, we found something interesting. A web of old logging trails. These weren't hiking paths, they were narrow, overgrown cuts through the forest where heavy machinery once passed. Along them were abandoned campsites littered with junk, mostly glass bottles of every color, and thick and half buried in the soil. Ceramic power line insulated, rusted scraps of metal, and everything felt like it had been left behind in a hurry decades ago. We guessed 1930s, but we were just kids while guessing. About a year later, when we were 15, we decided to go further than ever before. One important detail, his father had drilled firearm safety into us relentlessly. Not in a paranoid way, just the reality. If you were going deep into the woods, you carried protection. Bears weren't rare, and neither were strange encounters with trespassers or hunters who didn't want to be found out. So we packed water, snacks, minimal camping gear, and bought 2 rifles. When the plan was relatively simple, go as far as we could, and then turn back well before dark. At first, everything was familiar. It was the same trails and same landmarks. And then we noticed an older path branching off, narrower and more choked with brush. A shallow stream ran alongside it, threading through mossy stones. Something about it felt more interesting than the others the forest had reclaimed already, and we decided to follow that one. Along the trail we found more abandoned campsites, 4 of them. Junk piles, broken bottles, rusted remnants. One had a partially collapsed wooden shed with old cans and corroded tools inside. Nothing remarkable, but to 2 15-year-olds, it felt like uncovering some long-forgotten treasure. And we kept going. Another mile or so in, we noticed something ahead, a dark shape standing out unnaturally against the trees. Even from a distance, it was clear it wasn't a boulder or fallen tree. As we got closer, it resolved into a larger, rectangular wooden structure. It wasn't a house, nor shed. It looked industrial. Despite clearly being old, it was still in shockingly good condition. The wood was dark but intact. 6 windows ran along one long side, all shuttered, and a single door sat on the short end facing the trail. Along the steam side, rotted beams suggested there had once been a water wheel. And that's when we realized that the woods had gone quiet. The silence pressed in on us, thick and uncomfortable. We told ourselves, it must be nerves. And as we pushed open the door, we found it pitch black inside. The shutters blocked nearly all light, except for the thin, uneven slivers squeezing through the warped boards. The room was small and mostly empty, with a window on each side, another closed door straight ahead. Against the left wall was a workbench with a rusted saw blade and heavy chains curled in dead snakes. Nails jutted from walls at odd angles, and we didn't close the door behind us. We crossed the room and opened the next door. The second room was larger, 2 windows on each side, more rusted tools and scraps scattered around. Another door directly opposite us. The air felt colder here. We drifted towards the center of the room, the light from the open front door barely reaching us anymore. And just as we were walking further in, bam, the front door slammed shut. We both jumped, spinning around, rifles half raised. The flashlight beam shook as it swept the door. Nothing was there, just a faint glow of light leaking through the old boards. Must have been the wind, we told ourselves. But the woods were still quiet. We moved on quickly, suddenly desperate to leave. The third room was smaller again, almost identical to the first, except for a larger table against the wall with nothing on it. It looked newer than everything else. That's when the door behind us slammed shut, and we panicked. We raised our rifles and shouted, backing towards the final unopened door, the only one with light seeping through the boards, and we yelled again, louder, "Is someone there?" No answer. We threw the door open and burst outside. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, and we scanned the tree line. Nothing. No footsteps or voices, and somehow that felt worse. We started fast walking down the trail, following the stream back towards his house. As the structure faded from view, a shape caught my eye, standing just outside the door as we'd exited. Hadn't been there before. It looked like a person of average height. No features, just a darker shadow against the trees. But we didn't stop. Half a mile down the trail, we heard twigs snapping behind us, and when we turned, nothing moved. But there it was again, standing beside a tree far back, watching. "Why are you following us? We're armed," we shouted, but received no reply. It neither approached or retreated. It was just there. And so we ran. Finally, near a clearing not far from the house, we stopped. The tree line loomed at the edge of the open space, and there it stood. My friend fired a warning shot, and the sound cracked through the air. Time seemed to stutter. The figure didn't react at all, and we turned and ran for the house. We locked ourselves in the basement and played video games, pretending none of it had happened. Years later, with a group of friends and an ATV, we went back, followed the stream, found the campsites, but the building was gone. It just wasn't there anymore. I don't know how else to describe it. I don't know how to explain the story, but I know it kept me up many nights. Has anyone else had this sort of thing happen? Or perhaps an explanation? This happened about 3 years ago, and it was during one of my little road trip phases that I had when I moved to the city from my little hometown down south. It was spring break 2018. My teenage antics were at an all-time high, and I was only a sophomore in high school at the time. Needless to say, my friends and I were quite the avid users of alcohol, respectively. Not that I endorse its use or anything. I mean, we were just teens at the time. I had just made my trip down to my hometown and was relaxing at my friend's house, when my friend, who I was staying with at the time, suggested that we should take a camping trip and have some fun, since I was down there for the break. My friend's name is Doug, and our other friends invited to the trip were Lewis and Isaiah, while I am called Eric. Doug had found this really cool camping spot out by a lake that neither me, Lewis, or Isaiah had ever been to. And needless to say, I'm an outdoorsy person, and I was excited about the whole thing, not even the slightest bit aware of what awaited us. On the second day of my trip back to my town of youth, we had decided to head out early in the morning and pack a few beers and hard liquor bottles into the cooler with our other camping materials. This was a small town, mind you, so getting these things was as easy as taking candy from a baby. Since I was the only one with a license at the time, it was my responsibility to drive us, and since I was staying with Doug, that meant we only had to pick up Luis and Isaiah on the way. We began the drive to the camping spot, which is a good 45-minute drive from where the town was located. We blasted the tunes of uncanny rappers and nonchalant trap music that every teen was listening to at the time, although I wish I had a better taste in music. We drove past the trees that winded down the sides of our road, leading out of town, and almost always they would encompass the sunlight beaming overhead with their tall, sprawling branches. We cleared the wood in an opening of farm fields on both sides, while we were following an old road that had a turnoff, which one direction led to the highway, while the other led to an older, run-down, much more smaller town than ours, that led to the lake we were driving to. Without a second thought, I put the turn signal on leading to the road opposite of the highway, which led to a much more dense and dark forest. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, just as the others did, but this was much more noticeable, as we had barely enough sunlight to not turn our headlights off. The road turned to dirt, and the rocks could be heard bouncing off the sides of my tires. We passed the first few houses and immediately noticed there was something off about these houses. It wasn't that they were old trailers or anything. It's just that they all had a tin-like chimney that were pumping out smoke in the air, and it was the beginning of spring, so it wasn't even that cold. We continued down the old dirt path that led to the lake, and after passing the rest of the houses down that road, we noticed that almost all of the houses had the same tin-like chimney, with smoke blowing out the top. We arrived at the spot near the lake, and needless to say it was a pretty cool spot, since it was the only spot that had a bit of an opening in its trees on one side due to the lake being right next to us. The dirt path that led to the spot wound around in a circle, and in the middle there was a tiny grass patch with 3 tiny trees surrounding it. I parked my car next to the middle of the circle, and we decided to set up our tent near the patch with our soon-to-be campfire being in the middle of the patch. We split into 2 groups. Me and Doug were to gather firewood, while Luis and Isaiah gathered rocks to make the pit. Me and Doug headed the direction opposite of the lake, where the ever-so-dense forest awaited us with open arms to gather our sticks and leaves. "You meet any cute chicks up there in the city yet? Or are you too much of a wimp to even ask for their number?" Doug said. "You know me, man. It's always the latter." He laughed and I shrugged it off with a chuckle, as it's usually his motive to tease me since we're friends after all. As we gathered our firewood, Doug casually looked up from his task and noticed something up ahead in the tall grass, which almost surpassed our shoulders at this point. "You see that rusty old truck up there?" Doug asked. I looked up and saw what he alluded to and said, "You mean that old rust bucket? Yeah, I see it. Wonder who left it here." We casually picked up the remains of the firewood and headed back to our camping spot. Dusk was beginning to set in, and it was about that time that we cracked open the cooler full of liquor and sat down at the bristling campfire we made to accompany us. We sat in our circle, telling god-awful horror stories and failed attempts at getting ladies, all while laughing and having a good time as we sipped our beers and broke out the shots. The darkness around the campfire and the surrounding woods had completely set in at this point, and to say the least, we were all fairly drunk, since at this point we were all walking in a straight line around the campfire, acting as if we would pass a sobriety test. Doug fell next to the log we were sitting on, and Luis as well as Isaiah followed suit. While I wasn't exactly getting a grasp on our makeshift sobriety test and kept stumbling and falling over next to them, I took a long deep breath and exhaled with a bloated face as I could feel the alcohol lingering in my throat. I immediately felt a sudden urge to vomit, so I told them I would be right back, as they laughed even harder since they figured that I was going to do that. I made it all the way to where the tall grass was and let my stomach do the talking. I didn't notice how dark the surrounding area actually was until I finished my business and turned back to see the campfire in the distance, which looked like a small speck compared to what was surrounding us. Just then, I heard a rustling in the woods and turned around with my phone in hand and turned the flash on to see what caused the ruckus. Me being drunk at the time, I literally had no thoughts in my mind, and me being curious, I decided to go check it out and venture a bit deeper into the grass with the dark of the branches looming all around me. I stubbed my toe against what seemed to be a rock and almost let out a screech until I settled down and shrugged it off. I pulled my flashlight up to see what it was, and lo and behold, it was the front tire of the truck me and Doug had found earlier. I raised the flash a bit higher and got a better view of the whole truck and its layout. It was a rusty old green Ford, probably from the 90s or so, with a raised bed cover that had windows on the sides of the cover, with cracked glass on almost every one. It looked as if it had sat idle there for a good 10 years without moving. I raised my flash a bit higher towards the front cab of the truck and peered inside, seeing old newspapers, crushed up beer cans, and strangely enough, a few needles lying on the floorboard. That's when my curiosity simmered down a bit, and fear began to set in as I shifted my attention towards a sound that came from the back of the cab in the bed cover. I slowly walked, with every grass and leaf crunching under my feet, as if each step were 1,000 guns being shot at the same time. I reached the back of the cab and shakily raised my flash up the side of the truck and into the window of the back cab. The flashlight peered up the glass of the window, and as I raised it higher, my heart sank into complete and utter terror. What peered out of the glass at me was a man with eyes that had no pupils, and a smile that only a man on the edge of sanity could perform. He banged his arm against the glass, and the shock of the sound sent me flying onto my back into the grass and dropping my phone. I frantically grabbed my phone from the ground and without a second thought raised the light back to the man, only to see him banging on the window with much more force. His arms were bleeding as he had needles sticking out of both arms. His shirt tattered with years of misfortune and a face meshed with scars. He began to bulge his eyes from his sockets as he laughed horribly and began to cry hysterically. I let out a blood-curdling scream, and with my heart racing a mile a minute, I wasted no time in hightailing it from the truck back to the campfire. I turned around to see the man get out of the truck, and he turned to face me, tilting his head with a murderous smile and deep white eyes illuminating throughout the moonlight that shined down as he began to walk towards me. My running turned to sprinting, and I ended up slamming into the campfire that we set up, which made me fall face first into the gravel and dirt. The fire was now on its last legs and was almost out at this point. However, my legs were now caught in a bit of flame themselves, and with my frantic rolling about the ground, the fire on my pants was almost instantly put out. I looked up at my three friends who were all in complete fear at this point and oblivious to what lay in the woods beside us. I spluttered out that there was a man in the woods and in the truck. Out of breath, I said it as fast as I could, and that's where our attention shifted towards the truck in the tall grass. Two headlights beamed out of the grass, and the truck engine roared to life ferociously. All of our hearts sank as we instantly sobered up and realized the direness of the situation. Luis shouted for everyone to get in the car. Me, Doug, and Isaiah looked at each other in frantic agreement and booked into the car and locked the doors as soon as we got inside. Breathing heavily and shaking from what lied in the dark of the woods, we all agreed to start the car and get the hell out of Dodge. We started the car only to find the headlights of the truck began to move and encircle us around our campsite. I floored the accelerator and hightailed it from our camping spot, leaving the tent and booze behind, because at this point it didn't matter. The truck began to follow us and steadily gained speed on us as we began our death race towards the exit of the woods. The houses we had seen earlier all had their lights on, and with each house there was someone standing in the dark with the lights illuminating behind them, all of them standing there watching. The trees seemed as if they grew 100 feet higher, and now fully encased us within these woods, and the darkness felt as if it were chasing us out of its home and screaming at us in agony. The truck behind us was almost touching my bumper at this point when I peered in the rearview mirror and saw the man one last time. Suddenly we shot out from the dark of the woods and into the open farm fields from earlier, and the truck behind us slammed its brakes, and we could hear the screech of its tires so loudly it felt like it busted our eardrums. I looked in the mirror to see the truck slowly creep back again into the forest from whence it came, the darkness swallowing it up once more. We didn't play any music for the rest of the way home, nor did we speak a word to each other about what happened. Our heart rates were all up from the moment we pulled into Doug's driveway, and when we got out we let out a sigh of relief. We each made our way to his shed where he stayed, and we all grabbed water and some food to calm us down. We watched some comedies to try and talk our minds off the events that had transpired. Due to the constant laughing of the movies and shows we watched, I had to step outside as I thought I was having a panic attack. All I could hear was that man laughing at me hysterically. It shook in my head, and I took long breaths and headed back inside. I still keep in touch with these friends even though high school has all but ended, but they're still my closest friends and probably will be. Although I've yet to find my groove with the ladies and much hasn't changed since then, one thing will never change: the pure white of those man's eyes and his murderous smile. One thing that has bothered me until this very day is the fact that me and Doug noticed the truck very early on in the day, which means that man watched us for hours, and I can't help to think about what those people were doing on the porches just staring at us, doing nothing. Was all of this coordinated? Were they too scared of the man? Or are they like the man and wanted this corner of the globe to themselves? Now to start this off, I'm a 22-year-old dude with loads of energy. This will be relevant later. So much so, I usually take midnight walks around my house to get ready for bed, and I can't sleep until around 2 a.m. My parents recently told me they were going on vacation and needed a house sitter. Being the cheap parents they were, they asked me to watch their cabin in some random forest, 30 miles to the nearest town and 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. Cabin in the middle of nowhere, all alone with a lakefront view. Who could say no? I wished them good luck for their trip and arrived at the cabin the next day. The first day went well, because I thought they didn't have cable service, but I was wrong, they did. I fished, swam, and ate good food. But on the second day is when the nightmare started. The time was around 1:08 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep at all. I put on my boots and headed out in the cool night air for a little walk. I walked around the house a few times and stood by the edge of the thick forest. Just when I was about to head back to bed, I heard footsteps from the trees. Now I'm used to deer being everywhere around my house, but the footsteps sounded way heavier than normal deer. Being the curious chap, I threw a rock in the thick brush to see if it would run off. There was silence at first. Then I heard something I wish I hadn't. Laughter. Not from a normal person, but from someone who sounds insane. Then the same rock I threw was thrown right back at me. I had never ran so fast to my truck in all my life. When I turned on my car and the headlights came on, I could see a bald man still laughing where I was a second ago. I sped until I reached the end of our long driveway. Then I called the sheriff and had to wait for about an hour. When they got there, they thought I was joking, but when they checked where I told them, they found a rope, duct tape, and a long knife, as well as a faint, bloody trail leading them to another cabin somewhere far in the trees. Inside was just a bunch of scribbles like a child does and a rag covered in blood. The police looked all around, even checked our cabin, but he was never found. The next day my parents cancelled their trip and sold the place shortly after. I wonder whose blood was in the cabin and what would have happened if I hadn't have found the man in the woods. Back in the early 2000s, I had been walking my dog through a large wooded area in my hometown of Missouri. I came across a walking path that seemed seldom used, so I thought, why not? So as I'm walking down this path, I come across a cliff with about a 30-foot drop off into what looked like an old lake bed. The cliff was a large horseshoe shape, and the bed was very rocky. Out in the center, I saw what looked like a very large rock circle with a pentagram in the center. I thought to myself, I need to remember how I got here, and came back at night to see if I can catch a ritual happening or something. Fast forward a year later. A childhood buddy and I were hanging out with a college friend of mine, and we were looking for something to do on a Saturday night. It was July and I live in a college town, so there are not many parties going on. And the bar scene wasn't the same when school was out. When all of a sudden I had a bright idea. Hey, I found something way back in the woods. We should check it out. So armed with flashlights, we headed out into the night. Now here's where the story takes a turn, because we never made it to our destination. We're walking down a fairly deep trail in the woods. It was about 1 a.m, and we began to notice that things had gotten very quiet. We couldn't hear bugs or anything. And up ahead of us, about 50 yards away, I noticed what looked like someone standing near a tree, right where the trail starts to curve to the right. To be honest, it looked just like a black mass, but it was as tall as a person, so I assumed that's what it was. I went to point my flashlight at it to see who it was or what it was. But as soon as I raised my flashlight, the light went out. I looked at the flashlight confused because it had brand new batteries in it. I then looked up ahead at the mass just in time to see it streak across the path and into the woods. My buddies and I looked at each other for a few moments and then headed up towards the trees, unsure of what we witnessed. We moved on, despite my college buddy's pleas. He was from South Africa, and not being used to the woods, I told him that we didn't come all this way to turn back now. We got up to where the mass had been, and began to hear something running across what sounded like loose rocks. I assumed we had startled some deer in a nearby creek, and they were running off. The problem is the sound never faded. It was like the deer were running in place. And after a minute or so of listening to this, we decided it was best to head back to the car. Things were getting way too weird. Now fast forward another couple of weeks, and I'm sitting in the parking lot after a work softball game, telling this story to some co-workers. One of the managers, who has lived in the area his whole life, looked at me and said very loudly and matter-of-factly, "You know what you heard, don't you?" "No, what?" He began to tell me how the area had been a part of a nearby rock quarry, and in the early 1900s, there had been a few occurrences where blasting caps had gone off prematurely. He said, and I'll never forget this, "What you heard were those men trying to run out of the area before being buried alive." It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up even now, because thinking about it, it's exactly what it sounded like, and that black mass, I can only guess, was a worker running for his life before being crushed by falling quarry debris. I've gone back out there a few times over the years, but I've never heard the sound again. But that's okay, because it's a sound that has been burned into my memory, and I know I'll never forget it anyway. Red River Gorge is a beautiful place, but it's also massively unforgiving. It's full of dense forest, sheer cliffs, gorges so deep they swallow sound, and miles of wilderness that are completely cut off from the rest of the world. Even during the day it feels isolated. So one fall evening, my boyfriend Dylan and I decided to go camping there. We specifically chose one of the most backwoods campgrounds we could find, for privacy reasons. The sites were spread and far apart, barely visible from one another, and surrounded by thick woods on all sides. Our site sat right at the edge of a steep drop-off, the forest beyond it plunging sharply into darkness. We arrived just as the sun was setting and rushed to set up camp. By the time everything was ready, the light was gone. The woods closed in quickly, and the only thing keeping the darkness at bay was our small fire. We tried to relax, telling ourselves the uneasy feeling was just the isolation getting to us, and about 20 minutes into sitting by the fire, we heard howling. It didn't sound far away. The noise echoed through the gorge, bouncing off rock walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It sounded like wolves, and the realization that there were predators nearby made my stomach drop. Still, we didn't want to panic, so we stayed put, clinging to the firelight. Then about 10 minutes later, I heard something else. At first it was faint, almost like wind pushing through the trees below us. Then it became clearer, yelling. It was coming from beyond the edge of the cliff, maybe 15 feet away but far below our campsite. I told Dylan to be quiet and we froze. A woman was screaming. At first it wasn't words, just deep guttural shrieks that didn't sound like anything I had ever heard a person make in real life. Raw terror. That's when we heard the words. She was screaming, "Help me! Someone please help me!" She repeated it over and over, screaming at the top of her lungs. The sound echoed through the gorge, distorted by the cliffs and trees, making it sound like it was coming everywhere at once. I was terrified. My mind raced through every possible explanation. She could have been lost and fallen in the dark. She could have been attacked by an animal, a wolf, bear, or bitten by a snake. But something about the screaming scared me. It was like she never had to stop to breathe. She could just keep screaming. We didn't try to investigate. We just ran. We sprinted to the car, slammed the doors and locked them. I tried calling the police, but I had no service, not a single bar. And the screaming continued as I threw the car into reverse and sped down the dirt road, rocks flying beneath the tires. We didn't make it far before we saw 3 young men standing near the edge of the forest. I slowed down and cracked my window, still hearing the woman begging for help. "Do you hear that?" I asked. They all said yes. I told them there was a woman screaming for help somewhere down near the gorge. Without hesitation, 2 of them took off running straight into the darkness of the woods, disappearing between the trees without asking questions. The third stayed behind, standing beside my car, far too calm for what was happening. He kept saying he had no idea what was going on. I drove further down the dirt road until I found a spot wide enough to turn around. When I came back, the screaming had stopped completely. The 2 men were back by the roadside, and I asked where the woman was. One of them laughed lightly and said, "Don't worry, it's actually kind of funny. It was just a little kid at a campsite further down the trail. Having a nightmare? I didn't argue. I just said okay and drove away as fast as I could. We didn't go back to the campsite. We just went straight home. Once we were out the woods, I tried calling the local police station multiple times, but no one answered. In the weeks that followed, I searched local news obsessively. Accidents, missing person reports, anything that could explain what we heard. There was nothing. What makes it worse is that this happened in early November, after the camping season was mostly over. During our time there, we saw very few people. Most assumed there wouldn't be anyone around that late in the year. I know it wasn't a child. I've never heard screams like that in my life. Sometimes I wonder about those men. What the hell they were doing there. Why they were so calm. Loads of questions I'll never get the answers to. And perhaps things are better that way. Trying not to overthink things and just letting things be. Who knows if that woman was real or not, or it's some kind of complicated ruse to lure us out into the middle of nowhere and do God knows what to us. The details of this story are frustratingly vague, which somehow makes it worse. I didn't hear it from a friend or family member, but from a stranger I got talking to one night. Normally I'd dismiss something like that immediately, but the way they told the story really stuck with me. According to them, a teenage boy went out alone to hike in a dense stretch of forest in northern Florida. He told his family he'd been gone for the day and never returned. At first, everyone assumed he'd just gotten lost and would show up. Search crews were sent in, dogs were brought in, helicopters flew overhead. Days passed, and the days turned to weeks. Eventually, the search stopped. Then, officially, he was listed as missing. Unofficially, most people assumed the forest had taken him the way it takes so many. Sinkholes, animals, exposure, which means vanishing without an explanation. But months later, he was found. He was deep inside the forest, miles from the nearest marked trail, wandering barefoot along an old fire break, like he'd just woken up there. He was alive, but barely recognizable to the people who knew him. They said he moved like someone intoxicated, slow, unsteady, eyes unfocused. He slurred his words and laughed at things that weren't funny. Paramedics instantly assumed it had to do with drugs or alcohol, but the tests came back clean. There was nothing in his system at all. Physically, there was nothing that explained his condition. No major injuries, no dehydration severe enough to account for his mental state, or signs of poisoning. He just looked thin and exhausted, but not like someone who'd been surviving alone in the woods for months. Mentally, though, he wasn't really there. He kept saying he'd met someone out there, not a person or animal, just something, and whenever anyone asked him to explain, he'd shut down or start shaking. Sometimes he'd repeat the same sentence over and over, like stuck on a loop. Other times he'd stare past people and whisper that the woods were wrong. Doctors couldn't make sense of it. Psychologists couldn't get a coherent story. Over time he slowly improved, but it took months before he resembled his old self again. Even then, large chunks of time were missing from his memory. He couldn't remember how he survived. He couldn't remember where he slept. He couldn't remember what he ate. All he remembered clearly was the feeling that something in the forest had been aware of him, and once it noticed him, it didn't let him go. I later asked people who lived nearby or who had spent time hiking and camping in that forest, but none of them had heard of this specific story. That alone would normally convince me it was fake, but the stranger never claimed it was a famous or well-documented story. Just something that happened and just disappeared as time went by. But what is documented is how many people have gone into those woods over the years and never come back out. Some were attacked by animals, some were victims of other people, some were found dead under circumstances that never quite added up, and far too many were never found at all. I've driven through that forest myself late at night on a narrow highway that cuts straight through miles of blackness, the trees pressing close to the road, their trunks standing in endless rows watching the traffic pass through. Even during the day, the place feels off. I don't know if the story's true. I don't know if the teenager ever really encountered something strange, or if he simply broke in his isolation in the woods. But I do know the deep forests don't need monsters to be dangerous. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago, when I was 16 and living in the middle of nowhere. In fact, calling it the middle of nowhere feels like an understatement. The nearest town was a gas station, a dollar store, and that's pretty much it. When you grow up surrounded by nothing but trees and back roads, you either get bored or start looking for trouble. And I regret to say that my friends and I chose the second option. We got really into ghost hunting. We got cheap equipment, flashlights, and we'd poke around abandoned barns and old cemeteries. Most of the time it was uneventful. A strange noise here, a bad feeling there, until we decided to check out a place that locals refer to just as the Hollow. It used to be a mining settlement tucked deep into the woods, far from anything safe or convenient. The town didn't die slowly. From what we'd read, there were fires, cave-ins, sickness, and eventually the mines were abandoned altogether. People left, buildings collapsed, and the forest reclaimed everything, as it does. What remained was a state-managed park with a short trail, a few warning signs and miles of dense woods pressing in on all sides. Getting there was half the battle. I was driving an old sedan that had no business on narrow, rutted back roads. The deeper it went, the worse the roads became, until it felt like the forest was actively trying to keep us out. The sound of branches scraping along the sides of the car, fog settling low between the trees, even though the rest of the area was clear. There were 4 of us in total, and by the time we arrived it was already getting dark. We spotted a small lodge near the trailhead, lights on the inside, and decided to park further away to not draw attention to ourselves. That lasted about 5 minutes. An older park ranger walked out of the trees and questioned us, flashing the light in our faces, asking what we were doing out there so late. Once we explained, he relaxed a bit. Surprisingly, he didn't kick us out, but warned us. He told us he'd worked in that part for years, and that the Hollow wasn't like other places. There were strange noises at night, lights moving through the trees, and people go missing for hours only to show up confused and shaken. Then, very seriously, he made us promise not to do any rituals or symbols or chanting. Apparently people had been coming to do just that, and he wanted no part in it. We promised, and he let us pass. The moment we stepped past the marked trail and into the deeper woods, we could feel the change, and we also started hearing things. At first it sounded distant, like metal striking rock, and then voices, men talking. It came from different directions too, overlapping. The sound didn't echo. They felt contained, as if it was happening in pockets all around us. We started recording with a very cheap EVP device, more to calm ourselves down than anything. And when we heard it back, we could make out the words fire and death and collapse, and one voice that whispered something we couldn't make out. Eventually we came across what was left of a house, or maybe it had been a company building at some point. Half of it was burned out, with the roof sagging inwards and blackened beams exposed like broken ribs. 2 of us stayed back, while another friend and I approached, flashlight shaking in our hand. We turned around to say something stupid like, "Wish me luck," and both of our friends were frozen white as sheets, staring at the second floor. In the window above the doorway was an old man, only visible from the shoulders up, slightly transparent, like smoke taking on human shape, staring straight down at us. And then he was gone. He neither stepped back nor faded. 1 second he was there, the next he wasn't. We were just staring up at an empty window. I don't remember running, just the sound of my own breathing and branches tearing at my clothes as we collectively bolted back to the car. You'd have thought that would have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next day, we had to convince ourselves that it had all just been the adrenaline and our collective imagination. The woods looked normal, peaceful even. So we went back. This time we stayed together, moving in 2 pairs about 10 yards apart. I was in the back group, about 100 yards into the tree line where the trail vanished and the woods closed in again. At that exact same moment, my friend and I felt hands grab our shoulders, and right next to our ears, a soft voice said, "Hello." We spun around, but no one was there. We didn't speak, we just ran, and we've never been back to the hollow and don't plan to. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's collection of Deep Woods stories. Again, a very happy birthday to Justin. I hope you had a wonderful day. If you'd like your birthday shout out and to be able to pick the topic of your choice as Justin did on your birthday, you can message me on Patreon once you sign up, and I will do that for you. I would like to give an extra special thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for their support of the channel. It really does mean the world, and I will be back tomorrow with some camping stories. So I hope to see you there. But that's it from me. Until next time, stay awesome and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.